you start the book with a statistic that is pretty jaw-dropping, and it's a new Hootsuite survey saying that the average internet user is spending 2.5 hours per day on social media. So put that in perspective for us. This isn't about our kids. This isn't about our teenagers. This is about us. What happens if we're spending 2.5 hours a day on social media?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really glad that you caught that, because that's an important bit about this statistic is that, and this is one stat I pulled from Hootsuite, which is a social media management software company, but I've seen a similar stat in like 5 different places. So it's I would say it's corroborated. I'm not a statistician or a
Yeah.
sociologist, but this is not just one random stat I pulled. I've seen this across a number of different surveys. And yeah, so important to note, this is among internet users. So if not among all people, including people who don't use the internet. So this is among people who use the internet, which is a high percentage, obviously, of the overall population. But then also, like you said, this is a survey of adults. This is not a survey of young adults or only young adults or teenagers. If you think about, if you're listening as a parent, your kids, as in they're actually children or teenagers, only an 18-year-old who's a senior in high school really falls into, if you're thinking about this in terms of like a youth group, because I speak to a lot of youth groups and parents of youth group students. Only one of the years of this study, of the survey respondents in this study are even in your youth group. So yeah, this is 2.5 hours among adults, among the parents in the room. And that's on average. So obviously that means some folks are going to be using it less and some folks are going to be using it more. And I don't throw a ton of stats around in my book, The Wolf in Their Pockets, but this one I thought was just so striking and just so important for adults to recognize, is that this is not a young person problem anymore. Now, it is a problem among young people, but once upon a time in 2006 or 2008, you could have relegated social media to the youth room, if you will, and said, this is these young people in their phones. But anyone who's been around in the last handful of years knows that the parent of the teenager is on Facebook as much as the teenager is on Instagram or TikTok. And so I think for any parents listening, what this stat should maybe say is, hey, it's important for us to check ourselves here as much as we're checking our kids.
Yeah. And I remember hearing you say on another podcast, just think about that chunk of time. Like, what else do you do for that long? You go to work and you sleep. But what else do you do in that kind of concentrated time? So for us to really realize, wow, if we chunk all of our technology time together, that is a huge amount of time. And is that really where we want to be spending it? I love how in the book you give, and this is so much of life, is that there's one extreme or the other, and you're trying to hit that midpoint. So on one side with social media, you have this uncritical embrace. Like, yeah, what's the problem with it? It's the new world. This is how you meet people. Uncritical embrace. We love this thing. And then on the other side, we have this passive ignorance of, yeah, I'm not on it and I really don't care and I really don't need to know anything about it. So kind of help us understand those two spectrums and where we can kind of fall and help our children start to think about that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of our kids, as we think about teenagers, which let me say to any parents listening, my daughter's only 3, turning 3 this week.
So she's not on Snapchat right now.
No. In fact, this is a whole other conversation, perhaps for another podcast. Even on this one, we haven't posted a single picture of her on the internet. So she does not exist on the internet.
Good for you.
And that was intentional. Not to shame anybody who does that, but we had to make that a very intentional effort and choice, as I'm sure you can imagine. So she's not on Snapchat yet or anything, but so I'm not a parent of teenagers. However, I have been working in student ministry since I was a high schooler. So I've been among teenagers throughout the decade that I haven't been a teenager or in social media. And so I know kind of how this works. But most of your teenagers are not going to be passively ignorant with regard to social media. Maybe a few of them are like totally uninterested and definitely do not care at all. I would bet 9.5 out of 10 of every teenager is not going to be on that end of the social media spectrum where they're just totally disengaged and don't think it's important or anything like that. That's going to tend to be more the older boomers, like people like my grandparents' age or even toward the top of my parents' generation, that sort of thing. Among teenagers, the ones who may be in your home, for any parents listening, The uncritical embrace end of the spectrum is going to be much more common. That's going to be much more common just overall in the general population of, and what this looks like, you kind of described it as any new platform that comes around, any new feature of any platform. Oh, Instagram wants to be able to like I can put the temperature of the location that I'm at. All I have to do is just give it access to my location at any time. Okay, yeah, sure, why not? I might as well. And we make these trades to get these new features to express ourselves, and we don't always count the cost of what those trades are and what we may be giving up. That's kind of what uncritical embrace looks like. It's
Yes.
just not thinking critically about what all of this is doing to us, but just kind of embracing any new feature or piece of platform and technology that comes along. And so what I advocate for, I've long said on many podcasts and in the book, I think I even say, I am not anti-social media.
Mhm.
Nobody should hear me. I would understand if somebody felt that way, because I've written 2 books now on the ills of social media. That's just because I don't think anybody needs a book about the good of social media. I think we're all pretty aware of a lot of the good because we
Right.
use it. But I do think we ignore a lot of the ills or potential pitfalls. And so what I think we should do is not uncritically embrace social media or passively ignore it, but intentionally engage it. And what that means is, I'm not saying everybody needs to be on social media, by no means. If you don't want to be, gosh, avoid it and stay away from it if you can. But you should at least be educated about it. So like as a parent, if you don't want to be on Instagram, cool, but you should know like what's going on and how it works and how your kid could take advantage of other people or how your child could be taken advantage of. You should kind of know how these things work, even if you don't want to participate in them. Or if you do participate in them, which is going to be a lot of us, participate in them on your own terms, not on the platform's terms. And so something I've said many times is use social media. Don't let social media use you. And if that might sound like a weird phrasing or way to say that, but if you've ever been used by social media, you know exactly what I'm talking about,
Mhm.
where there's this, you're sort of beholden to it, and it has the ability to beckon you to pay it attention at any given time. And so that just looks like, I mean, we could walk through all kinds of practical ways to do that, but it looks like turning notifications off. Like, I've worked in social media my whole career. I used to run social media at Lifeway Christian Resources, one of the biggest Christian publishers in the world, and I never had notifications on my phone, and I didn't lose my job.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you can live on social media without having notifications on. You can set time limits. You know, all of these things.
Yeah.
I think we just have to grab our relationship with social media by the horns and say, I'm going to own this relationship. This
Right.
thing is not going to own me.
I
And
am in
that's something.
charge. Thank
Exactly.
you,
And that's
Silicon
something really,
Valley.
yeah. And that's something really only we can do. Nobody can do that for you. And so, but it takes effort. It takes
Yeah.
effort.
Yeah, and that is just really getting specific with practices and habits. I think of the book Atomic Habits and making it easy, not charging your phone in your room if you're not an emergency worker, like just putting those habits in place. One thing in your book that I thought was so eye-opening is because you see kids, teenagers, and they're in social media, and then you're thinking like, where did you get these ideas? Like, these are not the ideas that we have in our home. Like, where did this come from? And you just made that example that if just imagine if before you got married, you had no interest in foster kids at all, like none, like it is not on your radar at all. But then you get married and your spouse really wants to have a foster kid. Then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm open to that. Okay. And you start learning about it and then you get ready and you're like, okay, I'm going to foster too. Like this huge shift happens just because you're with your spouse, you love your spouse, and so talk about that part that we need to understand as parents, that if our kids are hanging out on Snapchat and Instagram, on TikTok, they're going to start hanging out with these people and become interested in what whichever celebrity they're following is interested in. Help us really grasp that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the main kind of case I make throughout the book, but also the claim I make at the beginning of it, is that social media is discipling the people in our lives more than we are. So if you're a parent, I think social media, if your kid's on social media, I think social media might be discipling your kid more than you are. And that doesn't mean you're bad. Like, that doesn't make you a bad
Yeah.
parent. I think that's just the reality of where we're at. Again, because if you think about, are you engaging face to face with your child for 2.5 hours every day on the subjects of the day? No, probably not. My daughter's, like I said, she's 3. She doesn't even go to school, and I'm not face to face with her for 2.5 hours every day. Most of us aren't doing that with anyone, let alone our kids, or if we're a leader in a church, the people that we're trying to disciple in our community groups or otherwise. And so if you spend some doing something, particularly consuming a source of media for 2.5 hours a day, just logic tell you don't have to be a psychologist or sociologist to know that, like, logic just says that's going to shape you. It's going to change you. It's going to change how you think and what you think. And I think, we devote a lot of attention and time, rightfully so, to how things like social media change what we think, right? They change our values. Like you said, like in my example about, if you get married and your spouse really wants to foster kids, or like I started hanging out with friends who really like Thai food. I'd never had Thai food before. I grew up in the Midwest and I didn't know of any good
Right.
Thai restaurants where I was growing up.
This Penang
And
curry is
yeah,
amazing.
right. Yeah. Like, oh my gosh, I've never had pad Thai. Wow, this is amazing. And so like these influences around
Yeah.
you just start to change your taste, like literally and figuratively, of like what's important to you and what takes charge in your mind, what gets a priority in your head. And so that's all good. We should pay attention to what what we think, how, like, we should pay attention to how what we think changes. However, I also think we should pay attention to how our mode of thinking changes, like the ways that we think, not just the subject of what we
Yeah.
think. But I think we should, especially in our kids, like, how are they force ranking priorities in their lives? Like, I think priorities are a huge deal. I devoted an entire chapter to how important priorities are. Like, I converge on being a robot. I'm a pretty disciplined person. I'm up at 5 o'clock in the morning, writing for like 2 hours before work a lot of days. Like, I'm pretty disciplined. I've never read Atomic Habits, but I feel like if I read it, I'd be
You
like, oh yeah,
live Atomic
yeah,
Habits. Yeah.
right. Not to say I'm above it, but I feel like
Right.
I'm probably doing a lot of it without even thinking
Yeah.
about it. And so I can get kind of robotic in that way. But I think it's important for us to recognize, like, priorities matter, and so all that's to say is, in your kids, social media, you may not, your kid may not be consuming any content they shouldn't. They may be staying away from all that, like, porn, or they may be not bullying their friends or being bullied by people. They may be staying away from all the bad stuff, and yet they still may be being shaped, like how they think, in a way that could be unhelpful and negative to them in the long term. And so I think those are the more, like, sort of understated.
Yeah.
One more point on this: the
Yeah.
Postman in Amusing Ourselves to Death talks about the difference between technology and medium. And technology is like the TV, and medium is like the culture that's created by the TV. So the sitcom or the news program or whatever else. I think as we think about the internet, it's important for us as leaders, whether parents or otherwise, to think about a difference between the social internet and social media. Social internet is the platforms and how they recommend content and how they shape how we think. And social media is the culture that's created. It's that content. It's the video or the picture or the meme or the article. And a ton of attention is given to social media, and rightfully so, because it's the food that we're consuming. But also we should be asking, like, what is the technology doing to us and to the people we care about? And that goes back to, like, how is a recommendation engine, an algorithm, changing how we decide what's important to us. And I think those are the things that are sort of a bit more insidious and harder to root out,
Yeah.
and that we should kind of search for in our kids that we care about.
Take